This is Schneider's hospital. This is where so many of the young hostages in particular have been taken after they have been freed by Hamas or other militants, and then they get taken over to this hospital where they are not only assessed by medical physicians and psychologists, but where some of the most moving reunions we have witnessed in the past 3 days take place. Children who haven't seen their parents, parents who haven't seen their children, those hugs, that joy, that burst of emotion takes place at that hospital. It's also where so many people who haven't seen daylight for 50 days are going to get reacclimated to what it means to be a free person after 50 days of being held hostage. Now, all of this is happening because we are in day 3 of a 4-day temporary truce between Hamas and Israel. We know that 17 Israelis and foreign nationals have already been freed today, some of them across the Rafah border crossing, but most of the Israelis actually made their way directly into Israeli soil by going through northern Gaza, something we hadn't seen previously. We also know that Palestinians are going to be released today as part of this deal, and we're going to go to a reporter on the ground on this story in just a moment. But in the meantime, preparations to release more of those Palestinian detainees, as I mentioned, is also advancing. Now, that's an Israeli military prison in the West Bank, where another 39 are expected to be released at any moment. The way this deal works is that once the Israeli hostages or the foreign nationals are freed, that's when Israel frees the Palestinian detainees. That's the scene we've seen in the past 2 days. They'll be taken to a checkpoint, and once those hostages are out, the Palestinians get freed. So far, 78 Palestinians have already found their freedom. Let's turn to CBC News senior international correspondent Margaret Evans, who's on the ground in Jerusalem. Margaret, what more can you tell us about today's exchange between the hostages and the detainees?
Well, as you were saying, Natasha, there are quite a few children in this latest release, at least 8. One of them is just 4 years old. She was 3 when she was taken captive. She was orphaned by the Hamas militants who launched those attacks on October 7th. There was also the release of a woman named Hagar and her 3 children with a Canadian connection, Hagar Brodich. Her husband, Avihai, is one of the main family members credited with getting the hostage movement underway, the pressure on the Israeli government to keep the return of the hostages home as the priority of this war. He set up a camp outside the Israeli Ministry of Defense in Tel Aviv with a chair and his dog, waiting, he said, finding some way to keep his hope alive that he would see his 3 children and their mother returned home to him. It turned into a huge movement, and tonight his kids are on that list. The Canadian connection is his brother, Aaron, who lives in Toronto, who hosted one of his nieces at summer camp there in Ontario this summer. He's here in Israel. He came back to support his brother, and he spoke earlier with my colleague Rosemary Barton. Have a little listen to what he had to say. I have to point out that this was before they knew for sure, or that they revealed for sure, that his family members were on the list.
Just hug them, just hug them. I think that's as far as I'm thinking right now. That's all I can think about. I think seeing my brother with them, I think for us, it will also be, time to let our guard down.
It gives you just a small sense of how emotional, heart-wrenching, excruciating these days are the families for the hostages, wondering whether they'll come back or not. The other thing to mention that's happening tonight, of course, is the second part of this exchange, which is Palestinians held in Israeli jails, 39 women, minors, teenagers being released this evening. We understand many of them to occupied East Jerusalem. That's taking place as well tonight, with some caveats. We understand Israelis pressuring the families of Palestinians not to show any overt signs of celebration. many Palestinians would say there's very little to celebrate these days, given the war in Gaza to begin with. But certainly these reunions between Palestinians waiting to see their loved ones return from jails are an important part of what's happening here tonight.
Margaret, you referenced the critical situation in Gaza right now. Can we talk about the humanitarian crisis there, how that's being managed?
Right. Well, as a part of this truce, this 4-day pause, we're supposed to see and have been seeing a big increase in the number of aid trucks being allowed into the Gaza Strip. Not just food, medicine, humanitarian supplies as we've seen in the past, but also fuel, diesel fuel so that trucks can move about, but also cooking fuel. There are well over 1 million Gazans displaced by this conflict. More than 1 million are being hosted, we're told, by UN agencies in schools and places like that, but living rough in camps. The Palestinian authorities the Hamas authorities running the Gaza Strip say that the death toll is now over 14,000 in Gaza. So it gives you a sense of just how desperate things are there. With the pause that's taking place, there has been aid distributed. We're told by Egypt that some aid has actually reached the north. There were complaints about it not getting up to the north. Of course, Israeli troops are still in place in northern Gaza. And today we saw images of the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, visiting some of those troops, those soldiers still in place in northern Gaza while this pause continues. He's pledging to continue this war until Hamas is removed from power, until Hamas has no longer any ability to strike against Israel. And this comes, of course, one day ahead of the end of the 4-day truce. So one more day in which Israelis might see more hostages released, Palestinians, more Palestinian prisoners from Israeli jails. A hard time for them, people wondering who's going to be on the list. But of course, there's also a lot of speculation about whether or not there can be a way to see this truce extended. We're hearing some reports that Hamas is looking to extend that truce. And in recent days, we've heard some talk from various Hamas spokespeople saying that there may be more hostages yet unidentified because, of course, the Hamas militants, the armed brigades in particular, were responsible for those cross-border attacks. But there are other Palestinian factions in Gaza, the Islamic Jihad, and some other groups potentially operating individually, according to analysts, who may or may not have taken hostages as well. It could be a bargaining chip, it could be reality, but it's the fact that it's kind of coming to the surface just now points to the end of this truce coming and the pressure that we're going to see as people try to figure out whether it's going to extend or whether this war is going to go back to the ferocity we've seen up to this point.
CBC News senior international correspondent Margaret Evans in Jerusalem. Thank you, Margaret. Now, among the hostages freed today, a 4-year-old girl with dual U.S. and Israeli citizenships. U.S. President Joe Biden spoke about her release and his hopes for extending the ceasefire. Our Katie Simpson is following that story for us from Washington. Katie, what did Biden say about this latest exchange?
The U.S. president and his senior officials have been a significant part of these negotiations. And Joe Biden says with every reunion, with every happy tear that's shed, he says it's a sign that this fragile deal and these talks are working. And he wants to build on it. For weeks, both publicly and privately, Biden has acknowledged the U.S. has pushed Israel to pause its bombardment of Gaza in the hopes it would create the space to facilitate the release of hostages and to get some badly needed humanitarian aid into Gaza. Now, the language he's used and the positions he's taken have not satisfied his critics, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But not long after this latest exchange took place, which included the release of a 4-year-old dual citizen American girl, Biden was asked about whether he'd like this pause in fighting to continue.
I would like to see us move to a point where we were able to well, let me put it this way. I'd like to see the pause go on as long as prisoners kept coming out.
The Biden administration has stopped short of calling for a ceasefire. They argue it would give Hamas an advantage. They say it would allow Hamas to regroup, refocus, and possibly pose even more of a threat to Israel.
If Biden is pushing so much and hoping so much for a continued ceasefire, continued truce, is there a chance that the Biden administration's support for Israel may shift?
Well, the word ceasefire, Biden has not called for that, and there's been intense pressure on Joe Biden to take that next step. Now, that is one aspect of the domestic pressure that Joe Biden is facing. A senior U.S. official would not rule out whether the U.S. is going to shift its support for Israel to put conditions on that support. Jake Sullivan, who is the U.S. National Security Advisor, was repeatedly asked whether Biden would impose conditions on Israel in order to provide that continued support. And he didn't rule it out, only pointing to the comments made by Biden on Friday when asked. President Biden described it as a worthwhile thought. Biden is badly losing support, mostly among young and progressive voters based on his handling of this conflict. What we've seen at rallies and what we've heard from some of these voters is they say they're frustrated. The White House has not called for a ceasefire specifically, and that their position is Israel's response is unacceptable, pointing to the deaths and destructions in Gaza. That is according to many of these voters who are expressing their frustration about the Biden administration. If the U.S. were to publicly impose conditions on continued support, that would be a definite shift.